Right, well, welcome to this week's drop-in session. This is another one of those commonly asked questions that we get. It's asked often in a variety of different ways, but essentially it boils down to when should we use detailed views? So I'll go into what that means in a second, a little bit more. When should we use detailed views, and when should we use links between different processes? So that's really what's behind the title there, detailed views versus processes. So in the first section, I want to dig into that a little bit. So just a little bit more about what we mean by the difference between a detailed view and a separate process. I'm going to provide a few tips and tricks on which approach that you should use. Talk very briefly about which approach that you should start with. And then what I want to do is use the last section to just go through practically how do we split processes. So I'm just going to go through using detailed views, setting up links, but also how do we split a large process into smaller pieces, or how would we merge separate processes into one if we needed to. So let me start then, as I said, with kind of a little bit about what's the difference between detailed views and links. So I think first of all, it's worth pointing out one of the kind of principles underlying Spark and the UPN approach is this idea of building hierarchical process models. And that provides a number of different benefits, but ultimately what it allows us to do is to create a summary or a very high level view of a process. Now that could be at different levels, but again, the higher level that we can provide, the more context it provides for everything that happens within that hierarchy. So if we can create or summarize a process at a very high level, it immediately allows us to communicate with different audiences that are going to be familiar with the processes at that level. So if it's, for example, if we were looking at an entire organization, we might create a very high level value chain for the entire organization. We often refer to that as the business on a page. So it's the core things that we do as an organization. So that might be setting the vision and strategy, developing products and or services, marketing, sales, delivery, through to customer support and aftercare. So it's all about that kind of summary. And again, that allows us to communicate effectively. It also helps us to understand the big processes in there and how they hand over to each other and who's responsible or accountable and owns each of those process areas. So essentially, conceptually, this is what we're doing. We're summarizing a process at one level. We break it down into another level, which again might have different audiences. We break it down into another level, and we can break processes down or build them up hierarchically in that way, depending on how much detail we might need. So we might be going down to work instruction level from a human perspective, so someone who needs to know how to do something. We might even go another level down where we're looking at what's the system doing, what are the business rules, and so on. So all the way, potentially all the way from that summary of the business on a page all the way down to the specific rules that a system would need to follow if you were building it to automate particular parts of a process. So that's conceptual. Now, technically in Spark, there's different ways in which we might build that hierarchy. So I guess the most common way is using a detailed view. So what a detailed view does is it allows us to create a single process, lay that, again, let's take that high level value chain for the organization, lay that out on one page, and then take each of those boxes or steps within that process and create a sub process for it, or what we call the detailed view. So you take that box, you click on it, you go create a new detailed view. And what that's doing in Spark is that's essentially creating a new diagram within that process. So we have one process, which I've very imaginatively called process 1 here. You imagine that first page that we create when we create that process is level 1 in this case. And then imagine if we had 3 activities on that diagram where we'd created detailed views, then you'd have 3 new diagrams. And here I've marked these as the level 2 diagrams. And then there might be activities on that which we break down again into a level 3, and we can keep doing that as many times as we want to. But essentially what we're doing when we're using detailed views is we're creating one process with multiple diagrams within it. And again, one of the reasons we might do it this way or use it in this way is we can keep processes readable, because we can lay a process out on one page that fits onto a computer screen, and then we can take each box and break that down into more detail. So that works quite nicely. But if you start trying to build the entire organizational hierarchy like that, that process will start to get very, very large. So what we tend to do in Spark in that case is then start to essentially create multiple processes that have multiple diagrams and link them together. Now, we might do this in an end-to-end fashion. The example I've used here is where we might create one process here, which is a sort of high level. I often refer to it as a sort of architectural process. It's giving us a visualization of the high level end to end. But then when we get down, again, in my example here to level 3, we might have further processes we need to define below that level. So we would start to do that in separate processes within the Spark or within your Spark workspace. So we've got one process here that has multiple diagrams that's very high level. But then when we need to drill down further, we would split that out. So here in my example, I've got a second process and a third process here. And they're all separate processes, but they've been linked together. So in this case, I'm linking them together vertically. So that the box on level 3 there is drilling down, and it would take me to a new process where when I opened that process, I'd be on that process's level 1. And again, I could have multiple boxes within that. Okay, so what this is allowing us to do is sort of break the processes down a little bit more granular, but still provide that hierarchical concept. So we've got a hierarchy up here, but we break that down into further hierarchies. And again, we might do this several levels down. So we could have another level of processes underneath that we're drilling down from here. We found that in most cases, you probably only need to do this once. You might have it a further level down if you were going into some really technical detail. Again, you could create all of this in one single process. Now I'm going to, in the next page, I'm just going to talk about why you might not do that. You could build that all into one, but again, there's some reasons we wouldn't. So what we do is we're actually creating multiple processes that themselves are at different levels, and then we're linking them together to create the hierarchy. So let's go and just have a quick look at what the different approach, or why you would use the different approaches. So there's 4 key things that I've pulled out here that I always think about when I'm looking at whether I need one single massive process or multiple processes linked together. So I think the first and foremost one is who needs to edit the process, and when do they need to edit it, I guess is a good way of thinking about it. If you've got, as you'll know, if you're using Spark, because we consider it to be a controlled environment, then we control the processes quite tightly. So you'll know that, for example, when you open a process, it always opens by default in view mode. Then you have to switch to editing to edit it. You'll know that we keep a quite rich history, a revision history of changes and so on. And one of the other things that we found to be quite useful is to restrict who can edit the process. So having one editor editing a process at a given time. Now, one of the challenges is if you start to build a very large process, you could quickly run into a situation where you have multiple people editing or needing to edit the process, or different parts of the process at the same time. So again, if that's the case, then that's that's a good situation where you might need to think about how do we break that process down into multiple parts or multiple processes, allowing more flexibility over who can edit it. I think maybe the second one here is probably more, certainly longer term is perhaps more important, is to think about, okay, who owns the process? So the way we set processes up in Spark, you assign you can assign a process owner for a given process. So again, it's worth thinking about, is there is the scope of the process and who owns it clear, and therefore is that a good scope to fit within a given process? So if you think back to the hierarchy, the architectural view, in a kind of a very generic organization, you might have that architectural view will be owned by the CEO. They ultimately would own the high level value chain of the organization. But at some point very quickly in that hierarchy, from that top level processes, you start to break down into the component parts of it. You're going to have different people. You're going to have the chief marketing officer, the chief sales officer, the chief financial officer, chief operations, each owning big chunks of that process. So therefore, thinking about breaking that process down based on the process owner. And again, there'll be things like communication. So if you've got process owner set up as a participant in there, if a change is made to that process or a comment made to it, it will communicate directly with that process owner. I said slightly longer term, so you might just want to think about how, actually, I'm going to come on to this in a second, but when you start, don't try to overthink the structure and who might be the process owner if you don't know that information earlier on. But as you start to formalize the processes, that's where it becomes really useful to do that. Third point on here is to think about just how big the process is. So this kind of relates to what I said about editing the process, but there are some limits. So there's some limits in terms of how your computer and browser might work. So the bigger the process is, essentially think of it this way: when you open a process, the system is trying to load all of the information from that process into your browser. So the bigger that process is, the more work that your browser would have to do. So you might start to notice things like it just taking a little bit longer to load, or if you're navigating around the process. As a very kind of general rule of thumb, you'll find that as you start getting to sort of 1,000 boxes within a process, you might start to notice some change in the performance. What I'll do in a second is, when I go through the actual splitting and merging part, then I'll show you how you can find those counts. And then the last point, again, is the useful one, is just thinking about whether this process is used multiple times. So I'm trying to think of a good example. So an example of that might be where you need to raise a process for raising a purchase order. That process could be called from multiple places across multiple different processes. You're essentially reusing that process across your different parts of your process model. That's another good point where you might build that in one particular part or one particular end-to-end process. So commonly you'd find that within the procure to pay process. But when you're referencing it from other places, then you would be pointing to that particular diagram within the P2P process. Just to kind of make that experience easier from an editor's perspective, you might consider taking that, raising the PO, and having that as a separate process itself. It would make it easier for people to find and link to if they're linking it to it from other places. So these are just some suggestions to think about. I think the kind of more important thing which we get that comes up certainly early on is which approach should you start with? And I alluded to it just before. The sort of tale of caution is, don't try to overthink it too early. we always recommend just start with a process, create a process and start building whatever you need to build, because actually splitting the process, if you start to build something that becomes too big, splitting it is pretty easy. Equally, if you do start by creating lots of what I call process fragments, so small processes, maybe you start your exercise by looking at some very small tactical processes, but you then subsequently realize that they actually become part of something bigger. Again, it's very easy to just merge those two things together. So I'm going to go through that and show you the sort of practically how that would work. So ultimately, which approach you should start with doesn't really matter. You've heard of this in many of our sessions before. It's more important to just get started and start building something, because it's like building a jigsaw puzzle. The more of it that you build, the more of it gets revealed, the easier it will be to make those decisions. So it doesn't matter whether you start with one process and start building something that becomes very big, it's easy to break down, or if you just start with small things and realize actually they're all part of something bigger, again, it's easier to merge or just link those things together. I suppose just one thing to be aware of, the more links that you create between processes, then at some point they'll become a bit more of a maintenance challenge for you. But we do provide tools in here in Spark for things like there's the report that shows you what the navigation links between processes. So again, that gives you a way to see it. And the health score tracker tool will also mark down if links are broken, for example. So if you've created a link from one process to another and it's become broken because a process has been moved or deleted, or something's been changed on that, then it will help you to identify those as well. So let's go in and have a look at the sort of, say, the practical side of it. So what I want to do, I'm just going to jump into edit mode here. I want to start with just being clear about what I mean by a detailed view, just for anyone who's not quite sure. So here I've got some example boxes here, which I'm going to use to go through this. Again, very high level. I've got a process here which is manage the employee life cycle. I've got a HR director as the role against it. You can see I've got as my input or trigger an approved business strategy. Output is this process is all about making sure we've got the right people in the right roles at the right time to be able to run our business or to achieve the strategy. So obviously that's being very high. I'd want to break that down into smaller pieces to understand what they are. So creating a detailed view is using this little icon on the top left here. Again, I'm sure most of you will know this, but click on that. The button that's highlighted is the main one I want to use here, which is the create detailed view. And when I click on that, it creates a new diagram, which is now called Manage Employee Lifecycle. So it's taken the name of that parent activity. And you'll see the breadcrumb expands by one position, so I can navigate back up to the top. And on the left-hand side here, I have my inputs and outputs. So these are the additional drawing tools I get once I've created a detailed view. If I drag these on, these are the inputs and outputs from that level above. So immediately it's giving me my scope, and then I can start mapping the process at this particular level. Essentially, I can start mapping the manage employee life cycle. Those inputs and outputs there will only be available if you've attached them to the box above. So if you've defined them but not drawn the lines on the box, they won't be there yet. Or if you've just put a box on that high level without any input and output, they won't be there. They are taken from that level above. Okay, so that's what we mean by a detailed view. I'm going to show you a navigation link in one of my other examples, but before what I'm going to do first of all, before I show you the splitting the process, I'm going to actually start by showing you the merging a process. So in this case, what I'm actually going to do is I've defined my employee life cycle somewhere else, and I want to have it as part of this process. So I'm going to bring it in here. Now, there's a couple of ways I can do this, but I'm going to show you kind of one of the probably most simple ways, first of all, and that is to just copy and paste into it. So what I've got over here is I've got an example hire to retire process, which is essentially managing the employee life cycle. I have made this one slightly smaller than the typical example I've got just for the purposes of this. I'll show you why. All I need to do though in this case is I can copy all of those, select all of those boxes like that. Now, you might not know this, but this works whether you're in edit mode or not. Okay, so you can actually select and copy boxes even when you're just viewing a process. You can only copy processes or boxes like this between processes in the same workspace. So if you wanted to copy boxes from one process in one workspace to another, you would first have to duplicate that process to the other workspace, and then you could copy and paste the boxes. Okay, so I've selected all the boxes here. Now in this case, I'm just going to do a Control-C on the keyboard to copy it. Now hopefully you just saw flashed up in the middle of the screen. It said it copied, it did it quite quickly. The bigger the process, so the more detailed views and so on you've got on there, the slightly longer that will take. It's always worth just making sure you get that little icon flash up to say that it's copied. And then you can flick back to your other process. I'm going to click to create a new detailed view on this one. And then what I'm going to do is paste in there. I'm going to do the Control-V to paste. The first thing you need to do is just click somewhere on the canvas to make sure it uses this as a reference point as to where to paste. And then I'm going to do a Control-V to paste it. Now, depending, as I say, on the size of the content that you've copied, this would influence how long this takes. And you'll see it get a little message comes up saying pasting large content may take a while. So you sometimes might have a little bit of a delay before that pops up. Even when it pops up, it's always worth just waiting for that to clear. It should take a couple of seconds. So there it goes. Now, as I said, I had a bigger version that I could copy in here, but it just takes a little bit longer, so I'd reduced it the size. You can copy and paste quite big processes in here. It just will take longer for that little routine to finish. Now, one of the things I wanted to also show you as part of this, so I've been able to copy and paste that in there. Now, one of the other things that's really useful when you're doing this is starting to get a kind of sense of how big that process is, or indeed how many boxes it is. So I'm just going to stop editing at this point, because one of the tools that's really useful when you're doing these exercises is in Business Tools, is if you go to the Analytics tab, the overview in Analytics, we use this to sort of help you start to judge the complexity of a given process. So you'll see straight away, it tells me the total number of boxes in this process is 220, and the number of diagrams I've got is 19. So that total boxes is all of the activity boxes, it's all of the input output boxes, and all of the note boxes. I think it includes images as well, but it does give you a breakdown here so you can see each of those. But that total number, that's that number I was talking about before. As I said, you'll probably find this will depend on the machine that you're using, but you'll probably find around about 1,000 boxes. You start to see some degradation in the performance when you're opening and navigating the processes. So this is quite good just to get a quick overview of how big or complex the current process is. I'm just going to click the little X to go back to my process, because the other tool that's going to be really useful to you in this is again over here on the left hand side, but above the Business Tools is the Diagram Explorer tool. Now, this is essentially a navigation tool. It allows you to navigate between all of the diagrams that you've got in the process, but you can see straight away visually, you can see a list of all the diagrams, and they're also indented hierarchically as you go down. So you can really start to get a sense of how many diagrams that there are in there, and how many levels of detail that goes down into. So for example, if I can see my diagram where I started the splitting and merging one, I can click on that and it will jump to that particular process. It also gives you a little count of how many diagrams are down there. So that can be quite useful, especially if you're looking at, you want to quickly see how many diagrams have I got in there, but at what point might I be splitting those out? So again, it's useful to be able to see that hierarchy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my last example box here just to show you how you can go about splitting a process out. I suppose one of the easiest things you could do is actually just copy and paste. So I could just copy and paste that box, copy it, and then or go into the detail view, copy all the boxes there, create a new process, paste the boxes in that way if I wanted to. That would work. Just go back into edit mode. But we do have a tool, we do have tools built in that allow you to do that directly in here. So this one down here is actually exactly the same one. This one has a couple more. This one's got an extra detailed view on it, so it's got slightly more diagrams. But if I go back up, if I realize that's the point that I want to split the process out as a separate process, so I want to create a new process called Manage Employee Lifecycle, then I can select that box. So, click once on it so that it's highlighted. And then if you go up to the edit menu on the left-hand side there, there's an option there which is called Copy Detailed View to a New Process. So if I click on that, it will open up this little panel on the left. So you'll see it puts the name of the activity straight into it. So what it's saying is I'm going to create a new process for you. I'm going to call it Manage Employee Lifecycle. It'll by default choose the same folder that the parent process in, but obviously I can click the little X here and choose a different folder somewhere else. And then you just click the copy content button. Now it is copying it, it's not moving it essentially. So it's making a copy of that particular process. So it will leave the box here. Now, what just happened there on the screen, hopefully you saw it, is that there was a bit of a pause. There was a message to say something was happening, a bit of a pause, and then a little green box appeared in the top right-hand corner to say that the process had been created. That's the point that it's finished that piece of work. So as I said, it's not deleting what's there already. It's just copying it. So if you now want to remove what's there, again, you can select that box, go to the edit menu, and there is an option there to clear the detailed view. So that would just remove anything that was underneath there. And now what I want to do is basically use a navigation link to link to that process. So you can do this from the detailed view button. If I click on that, there is an option there to add a navigation link. I tend to use it through the attachment panel. So if you click on the attachment panel, you'll find there is an option called navigation. So add navigation, find my other process, which was Manage Employee Lifecycle. So there's the process it's created. Like you can see, it's in the folder called Projects Drop-ins. I select that. Now, I do have the option to link specifically to a box in it, but in this case, I want to link to the whole process. That's kind of my next level down of detail I'm going to. So I select that, click Insert, confirm that, and it's now established that link on the process for me. And just to sort of complete this, just to show you, once you've made a link like that, a navigation link like that, just stop editing there. If I go back to Business Tools, we have this report called Related Processes. So as soon as you've started using navigation links, it will start to build something in here, and this will show you all of the links that you've made out to different processes. So it always starts with the current process in the central column. That's the box that I've put the link on, and you can see the process that it's linking to there. So again, if you've used that created like an architectural level view with lots of links to different processes, they'd all be listed here, and you can click through to those processes if you need to.